Hello, I'm Phil Shackelford, past board chair of the Bryan College Station Chamber of Commerce, and we're proud to have another one of our chamber chats exploring the topic of impact fees. As we announced, we're doing a four-part series in the area of impact fees, and today we're happy to have on Fred Dupriest, who's going to help us understand a perspective of perhaps neighborhoods, perspective perhaps within the realm of a proponent of a certain type of impact fees. And so, Fred, thank you for joining us.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, Fred, first, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what, with CSAN being relatively new in our community, tell us what CSAN stands for and a little bit about the organization.
Well, first of all, I retired about 10 years ago from ExxonMobil as an executive in the development company. And I've taught classes at A&M since then, and I'm still a professor at A&M. You're asking a question about CSAN, and I was a board member of CSAN until a little over a year ago. And so I can tell you a little bit about that organization. And I think you're asking because CSAN is really the only organization you could point to and say they represent neighborhoods. So when there's a discussion like this one, it's pretty natural for you to reach out to that organization. They formed it's a political action committee. Legally as it's formed. It formed back in about 2017 because of a series of decisions that had been made by the city council that were damaging to neighborhoods in a lot of opinion. They, and one in particular, they placed a highly active commercial business in a deed restricted residential neighborhood. They just rezoned the property. That kind of pushed the rock off the top of the hill, and there were a number of other decisions in those 2 years by the city council. And what you realized is that 300 people could show up with a petition, or however many you wanted, and that they may not have any influence. So CSAN was formed to actually be a voice for those communities, those neighborhoods that don't have a voice. And also realize that when it comes to neighborhoods, we actually technically have probably around 700, 600 single family neighborhoods. And many of those have no deed restrictions. And as I just mentioned, the fact you have a deed restriction may or may not be your protection. So that's their purpose. And that plays out in many different ways, including being a PAC and advocating for candidates who have a very balanced view of business and community.
Thank you for that explanation, Fred. And just because I feel like I need to ask a follow-up so that all of our listeners and viewers might understand, can you explain what the business was that you're referencing that was placed in a neighborhood that perhaps push things over edge?
Still involved in a lawsuit to defend itself 4 or 5 years later, and so it's probably better not to talk about that.
Better not. Okay. No, I appreciate that, Fred. And so, Fred, my understanding, and I don't want to, we'll let you do the speaking on this topic, but my understanding is that you're a proponent of impact fees. So tell us your perspective on impact fees, why, in your opinion, College Station needs impact fees, and let's go from there.
Well, first, it's really important to start by saying I'm not an expert on impact fees. I'm not really exactly sure who is, except for Dr. Perdue, who you had on another of these. It was excellent. I really enjoyed that. I try to follow a lot of the Texas A&M Realty Center publications, and if folks out there haven't seen that, Google it and go to their site and you'll find amazing articles, and they do numbers and facts, and that's the great thing about them. there's a lot of other sources of informational communities, but they do numbers and facts. So I'm not an expert, and I don't speak for CSAN, but I can, I think, express some of the concerns that you may not hear from one side or the other. The impact fee should probably, in my opinion, be called a subsidy, or not paying an impact fee should be called the impact subsidy. And that might be technically, in my opinion, more of a correct way of thinking of it. It is a fee that the state recognized and created the law, as Dr. Perdue really did a great job of explaining. I think it was 1987 that said, when a development comes in and an investor comes in and builds a neighborhood, and your city has to provide a service, sewage, lines, roads, and all that, or if they impact the area with increased service requirement, then you can recover that. And so cities didn't do that, though. And there's a scheme to that. It's really important to understand, and as I understand it, neighborhoods have never, ever paid for themselves. Not any city in the whole country, and everybody accepts that they don't pay for themselves. So if I put in sewage or whatever, I don't expect to get $1 back for $1. I might get 70 cents back. So how do cities not go broke? And the answer is that they get their money back from business, sales tax, and the fact that, commercial property value is usually higher, and it pays more tax per acre than residential. So there has to always be a balance there between neighborhoods losing money, and that's fine, and businesses actually compensating for that. So that's what we do. And what happens in though is that, as Perdue pointed out, every city in their exact situation in a moment has to be really looked at differently. Texas cities our size right now are going deep in debt, and debt is the real metric for whether our system is working or not. Now, we can get into detail about what a road would cost in the future and how the cost should be and how you proportion it. Don't get lost in those woods. We recognized we were going in debt around 8 or 9, well, actually in the early 2000s, there were proposals and studies to look at impact fees, because you could see the future debt. You could see the growth rate, the roads that were going to be built. One year we were looking at $300 million over the next 10 years in new roadways. You either go borrow all of that, or you start collecting more impact. You say, this balance isn't working, so let's move the impact up. Or you say, we're going to generally tax everybody more, and that's either property or sales tax increases. Well, in 2015, we did both property and sales tax increases, just because we were trying to get not ahead of the debt, but trying to make our shortfall not what it would have been. And we started looking at these impact fees again, and they had been looked at before. So that's what the impact fee is. And I think it's really important to understand that they are a subsidy that we give to a certain kind of business. Now, and I think that may not be how everyone sees that, because, well, it's houses, it's families, and those people will make money and they'll pay back. Well, that's already figured in. So the way.
So Fred, just to be sure I understand the argument, and don't let me put words in your mouth, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the impact fee itself subsidizes business, or the absence of an impact fee subsidizes business?
The absence.
Okay, the absence. Okay, so the argument is that the absence of an impact fee is a subsidy by the community to encourage business, based on that's the premise that you're sharing.
And we do that. We'll always do that, and there's no problem with that. And as long as you have that balance between your commercial income overpaying, you don't mind your neighborhoods underpaying. It's always been that way, always will be, I think. But when your city, now, right now, we're sitting at over $300 million in debt. I think it's about 3 years ago, and I read a really good article in the A&M Real Estate Center magazine about debt per capita in Texas. We have the second highest debt per capita in the state of Texas for a city our size. Only Beaumont was higher, and they had just gone through a devastating hurricane. There's not, you just have to stop. At some point, you have to stop and say, where's this going to end? It went up again this year. And it's not because of policemen and all those things. Those are maintenance things. All of that can be related, almost all of it, to the exact facility that had to be built for a neighborhood. So the debt that we have is really at the heart of the problem for myself in my own mind, because that's not how I work business, right? And that's not how a city stays healthy. At some point, we're going to have some things happen that make it that's going to come home to roost. So we're benefiting right now from extraordinary low interest rate and some other things that are going on. But the second highest debt per capita in the state is not a good thing. And it is pretty easily, I think, tied to infrastructure. Now, 2 city council meetings ago, the city council was presented information on the impact fees, and they asked staff to go back and said, look, we need to balance these numbers. We need to know all the numbers on both sides of this equation. And oddly enough, I've never seen that done before. So it was a really important thing. And I think Dr. Perdue mentioned that. We don't have the answers for what the balance is. So I don't know what they should be. I don't have an opinion on it. And I think it's very complicated, I think, as you've said. But the numbers hopefully are coming, and hopefully they'll be the right kind of numbers that we can actually sort that out. But debt is what forced us, not right now, but we established fees before. And before that, we were actually raising taxes, and people didn't want that for sure. That was the feedback. And then city leadership said, okay, if we don't tax it, you don't want to pay for this with taxes, then we're going to apply an impact fee. And that's when they were created. So that only those investors who are putting these developments in, or that it will be focused where the cost is actually coming from.
So Fred, if I were to ask, and again, this is an incredibly complicated topic, and so we want to try to do it's due diligence the best we can in this conversation. And again, I'd urge all of you, as Fred referenced, we do have it's not brief, it's an hour-long topic discussion on that Dr. Perdue gave just a lot of due diligence to the topic. So if you really want to dive into some of the minutia for how these things work and what happens with them, I would highly suggest it. The city also has some Impact Fee 101 conversations on their website that we'll be sure and share. But let me hone in on, gosh, okay, so let's hone in on the concept of an impact fee. Is it your opinion that an impact fee could be related to a tax, or is it a tax?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Not in my opinion. And I know Dr. Perdue called it that because it is using language that's used in the industry. But it doesn't, it's a subsidy. I'm doing something for you and not making you pay for it. Now, for example, we say, well, but it's for families and housing and all that. And well, but if the city's going to pay a subsidy, you can choose to subsidize lots of different private industries that everybody benefits from. Why not subsidize HEB and Kroger?
So the absence of the
pay for their expenses to build their store and sell food to people. So it's a choice that we've traditionally made, and I personally think it's a good thing. But what we're proving is that those costs are so high, it's just are what they are. Do the math.
Yeah.
And our growth in tax paying industry. Now, here's another structural problem we have. in every city we're talking about out there, most of them, whenever a person comes that needs a house to be built, they were brought here by a company on a job.
Mhm.
And that company's paying tax. And it's not a one-to-one, but it's something like that. Who's our company? Texas A&M, and they pay zero tax. So, I mean, I don't know what their properties are worth. I have no idea. I guess the land, 5,200 acres, is in the 10 to $15 billion range, and we know the stadium cost $500 million. None of that's being taxed. So, what is not paying tax in College Station? And if you read literature, you'll see that every university town has exactly the problem we have, because universities have grown so much with student loans and all kinds of dynamics going on. So we're not unique in being in a city that has a fundamental structural issue in the balance between commerce and subsidizing of houses. And again, we need numbers, and I'm just
Sure.
waving my hands here, but we need real numbers on why are we imbalanced, and what do we need to do to balance? Lacking higher taxes on other businesses instead of, subsidizing one industry, investment group of people at the expense and greater expense of all the rest of business in College Station. Is that what we want to do? Or do we want this one to pay a little bit more so these don't have to pay a little bit more over here? And that's the way I see the balance working out. And I think a lot of your members of the chamber there's a need for them to understand that they're footing the bill.
There's certainly varying perspectives, Fred, on this. And one of the things I hear out in the community, and I'm curious to get your take on this, because I hear that the absence of the impact fee is a subsidy for these developers and investors and folks that are building these neighborhoods and creating infrastructure issues in the city of College Station. And I don't think anyone would argue that there are infrastructure issues and that we need to invest in our future. We need to get further ahead of that curve than we are. We certainly can't attract business if we can't flush the commode. We can't attract, there are some real traffic and infrastructure needs of our community. What they would say is that by putting this impact fee upon them, you're not taxing them, you're taxing hardworking families that perhaps purchase a home in their development. So they're saying that they pass the fees on to the home buyer or to the end of the product. And Dr. Perdue referenced that. Is that a concern that essentially you're having perhaps a first-time home buyer in a local neighborhood foot the bill on that development fee?
Obviously that would be a concern, and especially I'm trying to speak for neighborhoods, right? So you would think I would, but I'm asking the rest of the city to pay for a few. And number one, but more so, this is not a subsidy to those people who are buying those houses. This subsidy goes to the investors. And that can be a group in anywhere in the world. And right now, if you're following real estate, the world is being bought by corporations that are pooling money and buying residential properties. And there's a lot of I don't care if you're in Singapore or College Station, Texas, single family homes are the new investment vehicle to get into solid property and out of Bitcoin and some other things people are worried about in markets and all that. So in Texas, for example, I'm going to try to hit several points here, but the first one is last year, in a typical year, single family homes, only about 10% are bought by corporations to rent or make money from. Last year, in a single year, that jumped to 20%. That's a stunning impact to have that kind of cash flow come in. It's part of what's driving our prices up, not impact fees, right? So a lot of what's happening in investment, we need to just step back from and really look at as a business transaction and how it works. The other thing is that the impact fee, or the subsidy, if you will, is being given to houses that cost $1 million or 800 or 500 or 1.2. This, is that who we're trying to help, or is that low income housing, or is that people who need a subsidy? Okay, and then the other, if you want to subsidize low income housing, let's define that. I'll tell you who I want to subsidize is 30-year-old millennials, 30 to 35-year-old millennials, because they're giving up. I mean, they're faster than they can save. Even if they're incredibly frugal, prices of properties are going up faster than they can save. Millennials can't get in a house, and it's serious. And
Fred, I heard a number the other day, $313,000 for a home in College Station, a starter home. A part of my question and concern in particular is, hardworking families, perhaps city employees, perhaps public servants, frankly, anybody that jointly would make under $100,000 a year, which is a good bit of our community. And I worry about the impact upon them.
Now, the millennials that can buy a house, and we're talking about people up to about 40 years old, their parents are putting a down payment. I mean, the statistics on that are pretty stunning. So if we're going to help a group, now, and that gets deep, because if you don't have home ownership, your city falls apart and your neighborhoods fall apart. And I'm not talking down to people who rent. I'm saying that that's a dynamic that's pretty dang well documented. So home ownership has always been really important in the United States, particularly. So if I were wanting to subsidize, then I would subsidize, I do targeted subsidies. I would look at houses under $250,000 first, and I would give them a break, and I would subsidize them more, meaning pay less impact fee. But when I look at other kinds of developments, there's hardly any of that out there. And if I'm looking at something under $250,000, I'm also looking at whether it's being built by a corporation to rent for unrelated students. What is the purpose of that? And I don't know how you write that into ordinances and all that, but my target is millennials who make under $100,000 basically, and trying to get into a house. That's me, and other people have different philosophies on that. But here's another thing. There's another layer to all of this, is that if you don't have the investor pay for those expenses, what happens to that money, that subsidy? So it's about, last year it was $20,000 a house or something like that. They reduced the house price by 20. You think that? Someone who develops a neighborhood will sell a house for whatever the market is. They don't say the market for this is $250, so I'll give it to you for $230.
Can I ask
so that, in that sense, you don't necessarily get the subsidy to the owner. The subsidy becomes profit potentially. Now, I get how complicated that is over time, and you think over time that kind of works out. We're not over time. We've got over 300 million in debt. It's happened very suddenly, and it's growing fast. And we've run out of, and we have no affordable housing. So and it's being compressed down where markets can't adjust over time. There's so much more demand that my subsidy is not reducing the price of houses.
Can I ask let's go with the figure of $20,000, because I think, I've heard between $15,000 and $22,000 from folks that have discussed this issue. Let's roll with $20,000. If you were to impose an impact fee flat across the board of $20,000 per new single family home built, and let's just talk single family homes rather than businesses. Businesses even has a whole nother angle, but where I think this affects our community the most is in single family housing. It's something that everybody, or the hope that everyone can relate with that subject of owning their own home, embracing the American dream, being a part of something like that. If you place a $22,000 impact fee upon every home that's built does that contribute to the rising cost of housing here in Bryan College Station?
Yes.
Because over time they're being passed on by the developer to the homeowner?
Yes, I think it does. But the question is, what are you doing about your $300 million debt?
Yeah, it's very, no, I
It's your
agree.
metric that says that you're wrong.
Yeah,
You're wrong. Whatever formulation you have, the Bryan, for example, pays 18% higher tax rate on their land. Well, because their land is worth a different value. Every city has to find a formula, but in the end, you got to balance your budget. So there's that. But the other thing is, don't do that.
right.
Don't charge that starter home $20,000. Now, homes already have an impact fee, I think of around 8 to 12, somewhere in that range. So we're not talking about a sudden 20,000. We're talking about an increase. And realize that you're still not paying probably half of your impact on the city, because that's the law. You either do the math and calculate the impact, and then subtract the taxes that will come in the future, which takes you down to about half of the cost. Or you can just choose 50%, whatever is easier, and the city can choose that and not ever charge more than 50%. So there's that. But like I say, I think we should, I don't know if it's a means test on income or something, but I have this concern that you have, and we all do, about affordable housing. But I'm not concerned with someone building an $800,000 house any more than I am with the new grocery store on the corner paying an impact fee. A little bit like you're saying. So the city council has asked for numbers, and those numbers are going to come back. And what will happen next is they're going to have to decide how much of this are we going to try to recover. We're only recovering about 18% of what we could right now. And are we going to try to recover 25 or 22? It's not going to be this, jump off the cliff 100%. And they get to decide whether they actually target that toward a particular community objective, like affordable housing for young people.
So Fred, we've talked about neighborhoods, and perhaps we're not necessarily done on that topic, or at least of the single family housing impact on with the impact fees. But let's talk about perhaps the impact that could have on new development or new business coming to town. I've living in town, we've always heard the rumors that Papa Do's might come to the to the University Drive Highway 6 corridor. We've heard about Trader Joe's, In-N-Out Burger, Sprouts, Whole Foods, all sorts of different entities that seem exciting, that might provide a greater quality of life and opportunities to have some different products and things here in our community. Does putting an impact fee the size that's being even bantied about that would affect new business coming to the area, does that encourage them less to come into our community? What would be your comment on that?
Well,
does that make it tougher to attract them? That would maybe be the question.
So you're talking about $15 an hour workers and whether their employer cares about an impact fee. The people you're worried about are Intel,
right.
Microsoft, all these companies that are going to Austin with $100,000 plus salaries. Those are millennials who need affordable housing. So I do worry about that. And that is where we have to grow our industry. That's serious tax paying industry that'll help us not need impact fees. So I agree with you, and I worry about that. But again, the solution isn't to not pay for $800,000 house, not to pay a fee, or a neighborhood full of $800,000. It's the neighborhood full of $150,000 to $250,000 houses, and do it.
So you think that there's really some opportunities, and let me ask this candidly, and in some ways thinking of CSAN and the business community and some of the way the politics is rolled out locally and how votes, and let's not get too deep into that, but do you think that there is room for compromise in these areas? Because I'm hearing some areas that you're saying, yeah, let's make a deal that begins to chip away at the revenue problems, but let's not throw out the golden goose immediately. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Now, again, I don't speak for any particular organization, but
Sure.
but my sense of it is that my views probably aren't very far from that of many people. And because it's just common sense, you can't keep piling up debt. Do something. If you're going to do something, be careful how you do it and who you hurt, because it doesn't hurt anybody for the city to run out and get debt, but you only get to play that game for so long. At some point, we're going to have to pay. And we're kind of at a point where we need to do something different. Let me hit another point. But to answer your question, we have a problem on this discussion because we don't compromise. We don't have any compromising language. We ask questions like, well, what's it going to do to hit $20,000 increase in house prices? There's no way that can happen. It's not going to happen. You know, the most can be 12,000, and we're at 100% of recovery.
Gotcha.
So why are we asking questions like that? Well, there's really a lack of understanding. It's not, I always, I teach my students, and I deal a lot with how to change how companies work to be more efficient and all that. And I teach my students, if you think your opponent is an evil person, then you're lost. You're not going to improve your organization. No one gets up in the morning and says, I think I'll go out and be evil today. We have different experiences, different perspectives, and different specific, what I'd call technical knowledge. And what you guys are doing in the chamber with these deals is what we need to be doing. With presentations, especially like Purdue's.
Fred, I really appreciate that. And let me just say, I have a fundamental belief that everyone that's involved in CSAN and everyone that isn't involved in CSAN, or everyone that's a developer, loves to come home to a great neighborhood. And I think that we all need to work together and talk about these issues realistically, so that we can build more consensus on this topic. And I really appreciate your willingness, to really, to really help bridge that path, because ultimately, we all live in a community that we love, and we want to see it live up to its highest potential. And I think that the only way we do that is engaging in dialogue. And that's certainly the goal of the Bryan College Station Chamber. And I appreciate you participating at that level.
I think that's really been a consistent approach from the chamber. We're really very consistent on that, and it's so critical to the community that we do that.
Fred, let me ask this. Well, first, is there anything else you'd like to discuss on this topic, or about neighborhoods, impact fees, revenue generation? I have one. I would like to ask one question, and then I'd also like you to say whatever else you'd like to say. Let me throw something that I learned the other day that made me scratch my head a little bit, because I know that this is a revenue generation tool, and the city, as I understand it, is exploring. I mean, we're exploring ways to develop revenue, but for infrastructure costs, for other items. So what level of extra income or reserve cash would be appropriate for the city to have? I recently learned, and we need to discuss this further, that perhaps there's $49 million in excess of the $42 million that they put back, that they're mandated. Their fiscal policy has them put back. Understanding that, look, they've got these $200 and $300 million worth of infrastructure potentially, that's going to need to happen over the next few years. What amount should they change their fiscal policy to say, look, we need to hold more cash for events like this winter storm and these other issues? Are they holding too much cash and now levying impact fees? Where is a logical middle there?
Well, and I'm not, again, I'm really out of my bailiwick here.
Sure.
But from my understanding, the event's already happened.
Yeah.
Last year, the state, year before maybe, the state said you're going to be limited on what you can increase your taxes to 3%.
Right.
But we got a reprieve because of COVID.
Right.
If we, when you start laying out the budget for the next years, the maintenance, the neighborhoods that we're building beyond an impact fee, they all have service costs. I mean, just look at the whole city and how all these expenses are expanding. We're going to need, if we have, and I don't know it's true, but if we have an extra 40 million we got together last year, it's already spent. And if you talk to the city council members right now, they don't see the math of how we're going to get through the next few years with 3% increases. Now, you can say, well, it's easy. You just fire a bunch of people, or you don't pick up garbage, or tell me exactly what you're talking about. Say, let's just cut taxes. And what part of the service and the quality of life that you have do you not want? Right. Well, people are evil, right? And inefficient. Well, don't go there. We already talked about that. So I don't know the details on that money, but I do know that we already know we have a structural debt issue or expense issue that we're facing, and it'll probably get used. So, but what is the right level of taxation? Yeah, don't know that. No clue.
Yeah, so I mean, I hear your point. You know, there's various options that we have. And you know, we just have to continue to explore them. Fred, anything else you'd like to share or discuss on the topic?
I think I would like to touch one other point. It's actually a big point, is that the city needs a strategy for what it wants to be, and we don't have one. In my opinion, we don't know what identity, College Station doesn't know what identity it's trying to land at. Are we going to be, and lacking that, we don't have common ground for developers and neighborhood interest and investors to try to say, okay, here's what we're all working toward. That could be something like, you know, we want to be known as the technology city. Look, we got A&M. We got incredible talent here. We can't be a city of subdivisions, a housing unit for Texas A&M, because that doesn't attract this tax-paying business. We have to be a healthy, complete community, and that's really at the root of everything going on here with this impact fee. We're out of balance, and until we get more industry that pays taxes, then we're going to stay that way. So how do we get to that, and what happens if we stay on the path we're on right now? We have a large area of the city that is in decay, and I'll call it that. It's certainly in decline. If you drive through College Station and all of our neighborhoods that are 30 to 50 years old, none of them, except for maybe South Side, which is a weird deal, none of them are turning over to the next generation of owners. And that means that they're becoming more and more rental. Old people die and they're being replaced by more renters. And that's what's happening. And it's a vast area of the city. We spent about 600 volunteer hours characterizing all those neighborhoods in a state of condition and all that about 2 years ago. And it was a little bit disturbing what we came away with when I was still on the CSAM board. And we're not sharing that because it's too disturbing to those neighborhoods. But when you look at the state of things, we need to reinvest in the older city. So one of the things that is coming out of this discussion about impact fees is we're incentivizing, subsidizing, and we're subsidizing people to move further away, put more traffic on the road, but we're subsidizing a competition with the older neighborhoods. I visited with a gentleman down in Southwood Valley and who is having serious crime problems. There's a lot I could go into there. And I said, well, the answer is, and he was saying the answer is, you know, we need people to come move back in and take ownership of this place. And again, I'm not talking about down to renters, but when you looked at this street, you'd say, yeah, nobody's taking care of anything here. So he had a meth house across the street, and he had collected all this data and given it to the police. They eventually, you know, worked on that and got it fixed. But I said, what's it going to take? And he said, stop subsidizing to send people out to the new neighborhoods. If you're going to give somebody money, and of course, he's talking about $20,000, give it to some young family to buy this house next door to fix it up. My point is not that I'm proposing that as a plan. My point is that you've got to look at the city holistically. What do you want it to be? What does it take to get there? If you're not taking care of big areas and you're actually funding people to move out and not turn those neighborhoods over, and if you're doing all these things have to be looked at one time. And my encouragement to city leadership, which has not done that in my opinion, is to establish what we want to be, share that with developers and neighborhoods. Because if you say you want me to be the tech city, I can say, okay, does this thing I want advance that? And developers can say, does this thing I want advance that? Do we need to reinvest in the center? Or do we need to do something to finance and encourage renewal? Can we ever achieve that? You want those young companies to come? They're going to come here if they can find housing, because all of their employees are low-wage employees. Intel, I mean, they have tech companies, but many of them anyway, the mass are going to be low-wage, and they actually are looking at low-income housing. There's a lady that got in front of the council 4 years ago at city council and said, I'm leaving. She had started a company, had 8 employees, and she said, I'm here to tell you why I'm leaving is I can't find affordable housing for my employees. And so, that I guess that would be my final thought, is that we need a holistic purpose that we can all get behind, and then we need to stick to it.
Well, Fred, I really appreciate you sharing all that. I really see that there's an opportunity to protect, you know, the American dream of home ownership for starter homes in this process, and it's certainly our hope that the powers that be and those making decisions take that perspective. Certainly, at a time where we're recovering from COVID, so many other things, you know, we urge that there's got to be a middle ground to this process, and I'm really encouraged to hear some of that today, Fred, and your opinions. And look, thank you for sharing these perspectives. You know, the goal, to remind all of our listeners and viewers, that the goal of this series is to discuss the topic, to engage in dialogue, to share varying perspectives, so that perhaps there's opportunities to come together. And so, Fred, thank you for sharing your perspectives, and hope everyone will continue to tune in. We'll have 2 more of the series on this, and thanks again for viewing today. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you for the opportunity, Phil. This is a really good series that you guys are doing, and I'll look forward to some more of these.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Take care.